Welcome to our webinar, Review 360 for SLPs, a deeper look at the embedded objects and strategies. Our presenter today is Judy Rudebusch, Educational Consultant. Now I'll turn it over to our Pearson Senior Product Manager, Nancy Castilleja.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. Since this is a little different than how we usually do this, want to let you know that for today's webinar, we'll be providing a certificate of attendance. There are no ASHA CEUs offered for today's session. So as long as you're on the line for our 60-minute presentation and we have you logged into ReadyTalk, we will send you the certificate of attendance. That will be emailed to you later today or tomorrow. So that seems so brief. I'm used to all the ASHA information. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Judy Rudebusch, and she will begin the session.
Thank you, Nancy. Welcome to this brief tutorial on Review 360 for SLPs, a deeper look at the embedded objectives and strategies. Thank you again for joining us. In terms of disclosures, I am Judy Rudebusch, the lead author of Review 360 for SLPs, and receive compensation for product development. There is no relevant non-financial information to disclose. This course content focuses primarily on Review 360 for SLPs. There are no other similar products discussed during this presentation, and Pearson Clinical Assessment is the sponsor of this presentation and is the publisher of Review 360 for SLPs. Let's look at the session agenda. The desired outcome of this tutorial is to provide the context and rationale for both the goals or objectives and the interventions that are available for you in Review 360 for SLPs. We will look at the child-centered process outlined in IDEA, the Federal Special Education Law, and then move quickly through SMART goals for standards-based IEPs. Next, we will consider standards-based SLP services. Most states have adopted the Common Core state standard, so examples are provided relative to the Common Core. If you work in a state that has not adopted the Common Core, the same alignment can be made between Review 360 and your state standards. We will finish with case studies to apply this information. So let's begin with a reminder about IDEA and the child-centered process for identification of disabilities and the IEP planning process designed to help students with disabilities make progress in the general education curriculum. The IDEA child-centered process for school-aged children usually begins when there is academic or behavioral struggle in the classroom. In many school districts, the pre-referral interventions that have always been required in IDEA are provided through a response to intervention, or RTI process, where the student is provided with support in the classroom or targeted intervention to work on the skills needed to keep pace with others in the general education classroom at grade level. RTI allows for support for struggling students at increasing levels and intensity. RTI is linked with a newer term, Multi-Tier System of Supports, or MTSS. The 2015 Every Student Succeeds Act references MTSS rather than RTI. When the student does not respond to the intervention provided, a referral to special education may be warranted. Following informed consent, evaluation is completed and the IEP team makes a determination regarding eligibility for special education services. If the student is eligible, an individualized education program, or IEP, is developed to support the students with disability in making progress in the general curriculum. On the next slide, you can see that the IEP process has three distinct phases that are sequential: IEP development, placement decisions, and implementation. For initial IEP development, the IEP team considers the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, or class, that are described in the evaluation report. IEP goals and objectives are developed based on grade level expectations from the standards and the gap between present level of performance and grade level standards. Review360 for SLPs lists goals and objectives that are either tied to grade level standards or age level expectations for functional skills not represented in the standards. Moving on to placement decisions, placement must be in the least restrictive environment with specification of frequency, location, and duration of services noted in the IEP. Implementation of the standards-based IEP should focus on both educationally relevant services and activities and be chosen to the extent possible on the basis of research or evidence that points to the likely effectiveness and efficacy of SLP services. Along with implementation, progress monitoring is critical to develop the new present level statement as a component of evidence-based service delivery and in order to plan the next IEP. So we go from development to placement to implementation with progress monitoring in order to determine the next cycle for the IEP. Review360 for SLPs provides a jump start for standards-based goals and objectives that are tied to the Common Core State Standards. You can see that I've highlighted just where Review360 for SLPs aligns with the IEP process. The Common Core State Standards have been based on research and evidence-based practice. Available in Review360 are approaches that we have included to facilitate therapy planning and service delivery. So in the development phase, there are goals and objectives. At the implementation phase, we have standards-based, educationally relevant services, evidence-based intervention, and strategies in order to collect progress monitoring data to develop the new goals and objectives based on present levels. So it is a continuous process that's based on student data about progress in the IEP. Let's move on to SMART goals and objectives. The context for development of Review360 for SLPs is based on a SMART process. There are 3 steps in the development of a standards-based goal. First, look at student expectations for grade level in the standards. SLPs will review and use the relevant standards for the student that have language and speech underpinnings. Step 2 is to determine the present levels relative to expectations. And step 3 is to write IEP goals and objectives that are measurable and achievable and that help the student meet expectations in the standards. So in addition to working to improve speech sound production or language skills, for example, the SLP also monitors use of the skills relative to grade level standards. As a reminder, SMART can be an acronym for specific, measurable, attainable, results-oriented, and time-bound. Many districts have applied the SMART process to their goals and objectives for all of special education. And so we use this in order to make sure that we're aligning to standards and writing goals that are actually attainable and that we can measure progress on. Next, the components that are specified in a SMART standards-based goal are the timeline, the condition of performance, the observable behavior that will be measured, and the level of performance expected for mastery. Let's look at some examples. By the end of 36 weeks, the student will demonstrate use of age or grade level oral language by using grammatically correct sentences containing prepositional phrases with 70% accuracy. So you can see in this example, each of the components of a SMART goal are included. Another example for speech sound production. By the end of 36 weeks, the student will demonstrate production of R in all contexts in connected speech with 75% accuracy. Let's look at a couple of more examples. For phonological processes, by the end of 36 weeks, the student will reduce use of word and syllable patterns with consonant cluster simplification and consonant cluster reduction to 20% of occurrences, or 80% correct production, monitored over 4 consecutive intervention sessions. Another example for morphology syntax. By the end of 36 weeks, the student will demonstrate grade-level grammar by using reflexive pronouns with 75% accuracy when telling familiar narratives monitored for 5 stories produced over 3 consecutive intervention sessions. So with each of these examples, you can see the timeline, usually indicated by an annual period, but you can adjust that based on student needs and your anticipation of the timeline needed for goal mastery. You also see the condition of performance, such as reducing use of word and syllable patterns or demonstrating grade level grammar. And you can see the observable behavior, which is what is being measured. For the phonological process example, the observable behavior is use of word and syllable patterns with consonant cluster simplification and consonant cluster reduction will be reduced. So what you're tracking is correct production of consonant clusters for the 80% criteria, or the use of the incorrect phonological process to 20% of occurrences. And then monitored over 4 consecutive intervention sessions gives you a little bit more information about the level of performance expected and the time frame for measurement of correct production towards mastery. Let's move on to think about linking goals to standards-based and evidence-based intervention. In my way of thinking, educational relevance is at the intersection of quality services and standards-based SLP services for both functional and academic skills. You are familiar with traffic circles. You know that they seem dynamic and fluid because traffic keeps moving as cars enter and exit the circle. But it works when everyone knows what they are doing and keeps moving. The same can be said of planning for educationally relevant SLP services. Planning and delivery is dynamic, fluid, and keeps moving based on the needs of the students. When you're looking at the Common Core state standards, we find that they include reading standards, writing standards, speaking and listening standards, and language standards. All four of these areas are pretty exciting for the speech-language pathologist when planning educationally relevant intervention. You can find ties to language underpinnings in reading standards for literature, for informational text, and for foundational skills. We can certainly find language underpinnings in writing and know that when we see evidence of use of grade level syntax and morphology in writing that the student really has taken grasp of and owns that skill. In speaking and listening standards and language standards, we see quite a bit of specificity relative to oral communication for speaking and listening and pragmatic use of language. The language standards are heavily loaded and very rich for the work that we do in the areas of semantics, syntax, and morphology. The standards are rigorous and rich, as I've mentioned, with the types of skills that students with speech-language impairment need to work on. The reading and writing standards are good sources for developing targets for SLPs to work on with their standards on their caseload. So I encourage you to be familiar with grade level standards across all 4 of these areas. When looking at, on the next slide, when looking at the key points in the area of language standards, you can see that based on the broad areas of language covered in the Common Core, students with language disorders may have difficulty meeting expectations. Students are expected to grow vocabulary through conversations, direct instruction, and readings. Students are expected to determine word meanings, appreciate nuances, and expand their repertoire of vocabulary and use of vocabulary. They are expected to use formal English in writing and speaking, and they are expected to be able to choose many ways to express themselves depending on the situation. So you can see that across grade levels from kindergarten through 12th grade, there are grade level standards for semantics, syntax morphology, pragmatics, and metalinguistics. Thinking further about language, let's think about academic language. As we work on language skills in the school setting, we should focus on academic language, which is specialized language used to talk about disciplinary content within the school setting. Academic language is lexically, syntactically, and pragmatically specialized and tends to contain relatively high volume of morphologically complex words drawn from Latin and Greek. Academic language includes morphologically complex words and refined lexical relations among words. So students with language disorders will certainly struggle keeping pace with the rigorous demands of the Common Core state standards or the state standards in your state if not a Common Core state. This reference to academic language, by way of a note, is further justification for the importance of tying your work as a speech-language pathologist to grade level standards to help students do better in school and feel like they're smarter and can really master the standards at grade level and do well in school. Now let's look a little bit at Review360 for SLPs and how we align the objectives with the Common Core state standards. Review360 for SLPs contains specific and overt ties to grade level standards in speech, sound production, voice, and fluency, as you can see on this slide. In the area of articulation, the expectation is that students speak clearly at an understandable pace and use appropriate eye contact, adequate volume, and clear pronunciation. So clear speech and correct speech sound production is reflected, albeit indirectly, in the Common Core standards from grades 3 through 8. If you have a student with speech sound production problems in kindergarten through 2nd, you'll be using age-level expectations that are present in the literature in terms of your targets for your IEP. In the area of voice, students are expected at kindergarten through 2nd grade to speak audibly and express their thoughts, feelings, and ideas clearly. They are expected to use appropriate eye contact, adequate volume, and clear pronunciation in the later grades. It looks like grades 6, 7, and 8. In the area of fluency, Students are expected in grades 3, 4, and 5 to speak clearly at an understandable pace. Remember that the SLP also works on functional performance, so that if the student needs to work on speech sound production, voice, or fluency, it is allowed and expected that the SLP will do so even without a direct link to the standard. Language skills, however, as reflected on the next two slides, should be directly linked to grade level standards, and specific IEP goals and objectives should be matched to grade level. For example, in the area of vocabulary and semantics and syntactic complexity, you want to select specific targets the student needs to know at that grade level or a lower grade level. Let's look at a couple of them. For pronouns, you can work in grades 1 through 12 on a standards-based goal for pronouns. Students are expected to, depending on grade level, use personal, possessive, and indefinite pronouns and reflexive pronouns. When you're looking at conjunctions, students in grades 1 through 12 are expected in the standards to use coordinating and subordinating conjunctions depending on grade level. Note that in the area of phrases and clauses, students in kindergarten through 12th grade are expected to produce simple, compound, complex sentences. Actually, complex sentences comes in at 3rd grade, I believe, and form and use prepositional phrases. So the ability to use simple sentences that have noun, verb, and are complete sentences is expected of 5-year-olds at kindergarten. In the area of semantics, we've divided semantics into 5 areas: basic concepts, grade level vocabulary, tier 2 vocabulary, multiple meaning words, and figurative language. These are the areas that seem to present the most problem in the area of semantics for students with language disorders with a semantic base. By way of an example, look at tier 2 vocabulary. Students are expected to acquire and use grade-appropriate conversational, general academic, and domain-specific words and phrases that are basic to a particular topic. So the speech-language pathologist may want to spend quite a bit of time working on tier 2 vocabulary that helps students with rich vocabulary at grade level that crosses different content areas, and then work with teachers to concentrate on the tier 3 or content-specific vocabulary that is represented in each of the content areas like science, social studies, mathematics, and English, language arts, and reading. So there's a great way in terms of using Review360 for developing your goals and objectives to also have a talking point with teachers to coordinate your work on semantics. Quite a few people in a school building spend their time working on vocabulary. So for language disordered students, it's really, really important to coordinate that work and to maximize the effectiveness and support for the students who struggle with semantics. On the next slide, we can see that there is alignment with pragmatics and some literacy connections from kindergarten through 12th grade. In the area of oral narratives, look at the reading standards, and you can see that in the reading standards, students in kindergarten through 3rd grade are expected to describe characters, settings, and major events in a story using key details. In the speaking and listening standards, you find standards available to hook your IEP goals to in the areas of discourse, topic maintenance, and communicative attention. There's also work that represents a difficulty for many language learning disabled children in terms of inferencing, prediction, and drawing conclusions. And that starts in, you'll see, in 4th grade and goes through 12th grade. In the earlier grades, we tend to work with teachers on phonological awareness and phonology skills and can find some links to standards in the Reading Standards Foundational Skills in terms of phonological awareness, grades kindergarten through 3rd grade. Students are expected to demonstrate understanding of spoken words, syllables, and phonemes, produce rhyming words, blend and segment syllables and words. Because the standards are represented in the reading standards for foundational skills, it's really important to coordinate your work with the classroom teacher in terms of the pacing of your instruction in therapy, the scope and sequence, and matching your activities to what's going on in the classroom to provide even more scaffolding than you're already providing for that student with phonological awareness deficits. So you can see that Review360 for SLPs pays attention to the links between measurable goals and objectives written in a SMART format with grade level standards, and thereby provides you a path towards educationally relevant service delivery. And as we move over to look at evidence-based practices, we can see that the intervention strategies suggested in Review360 are research-based when possible or evidence-based to the extent available in the professional literature. In the area of speech sound production, production training, and Van Riper's traditional approach are certainly familiar to school-based SLPs and have probably the most robust data, research data behind them. The cycles approach and the complexity approach for intervention with phonological processes have more than 20 years of research, validation, and treatment effectiveness data behind them. In the area of motor speech, we have good evidence-based strategies, but not as strong of a research base as the other approaches. So when you go into the evidence-based practices or the interventions, once you've developed the IEP goals and objectives, you can have some assurance that you're on the right path to selecting intervention approaches with a strong evidence base or research base, or at least as strong as is represented in the literature. Moving on to looking at fluency and voice, we have fluency shaping, stuttering modification, and cluttering therapy strategies that are explained, described, and with step-by-step implementation tips given in Review360. For voice, the voice strategies were selected based on the work of Boone and Colton, Casper, and Leonard. So there are strategies to get you started in terms of working with a student in the area of phonation misuse, pitch extension strategies, resonance, loudness, and respiration strategies. So again, in Review360, you'll see a description of the target skills and a brief description of how to implement the approach or strategy. In the areas of language, semantics, syntax, morphology, and pragmatics, there were few, if any, research-based intervention approaches that would be useful in a school setting. So instead, we turned to evidence-based practice and conducted a review of professional literature across the areas of speech-language pathology, reading, language arts, and English as a second language to identify strategies with some sort of evidence base as a springboard to getting started with standards-based, educationally relevant SLP service delivery. In the example on this slide, we're looking at semantics. And there are several strategies in the area of basic concepts, for example, milieu teaching, drill play activities, script therapy, and graphic organizers. So if the IEP goal or objective is in an area of basic concepts related to the grade level standard, and you're working on single word basic vocabulary, you can start your therapy planning, your intervention planning, with one or more of these strategies, and have some assurance that there's an evidence base behind the strategies listed. In the area of using grade level vocabulary, another semantics objective or area, there are strategies such as word web, read and respond, question and modeled answer, an activity called which words belong, and multiple meaning match. So again, in Review 360, what we have are evidence-based interventions, research-based interventions, and then evidence-based strategies to get you started, especially in the areas of fluency, voice, and the language areas. This example is just about 2 of the 5 areas in semantics that we've looked at to give you an idea of where to go in Review 360 to read about the target skill and then to get a description of the intervention approach that you want to use. So now let's look at 3 examples of how to use Review 360 as a tool to facilitate educationally relevant SLP services. There are 6 steps for effective use of Review 360 for SLPs. First, we want to review relevant standards to identify the skills needed for success. Next, we want to identify the language and communication skills needed for success, or the language underpinnings of the standard. Third, we want to identify the student's current skills and needs in terms of the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance statement and the IEP goals and objectives. And then we want to review classroom materials, activities, determine the points of collaboration with the classroom teacher and the parents to maximize practice opportunities and to maximize success for the students. Then we want to design and implement the intervention. And then finally, we want to monitor progress. So I've mentioned that this whole process is a loop. The places where Review 360 is most powerful are in the areas of looking at the student's current skills and needs, the present level statement to determine a SMART, standards-based goal. So there are goals and objectives and wording for measurable goals and objectives in Review 360. And then designing and implementing the intervention. I mentioned research-based or evidence-based interventions and or strategies. And then finally, monitoring progress relative to the specific measurable objective so that you have data to support the present levels to begin the process again if it is needed in the IEP planning process, annual planning process. So let's start with case study number 1, which is the phonological processes example. Joey is age 5 and he's in kindergarten. He started speech therapy at age 3.5. At that time, he presented with no final consonants or consonant clusters. He had lengthy utterances with the appropriate number of syllables, but again, no final consonants or consonant clusters. He was enrolled in a phonological process approach intervention, and in the first cycle, he was working on word final P and T, S clusters, word final velars, and facilitation of pre-vocalic liquids. In the second cycle of the cycles approach, he'd gotten made progress, noticeable progress with word final consonants, and so they moved on to working on clusters. The S clusters continued, liquid clusters were added, medial and final ST, more S clusters, and other clusters. So that's the background information that you have about Joey. Then, as we move into the planning process, you can see that the relevant standards for kindergarten for Joey were in the area of literacy, And he was supposed to, the relevant standards for kindergartners that were relevant for Joey that he may struggle with, demonstrate understanding of spoken words, syllables, and sounds or phonemes, isolate and pronounce initial, medial, and final sounds in consonant, vowel, consonant words, and add or substitute individual sounds in simple one-syllable words to make new words. So phonological awareness goals or standards in kindergarten. Joey's present level at the time that this process was started for planning in kindergarten was that he had improved and was now able to produce final consonants in his speech. He still needs to work on consonant clusters. His speech intelligibility at 3.5 years of age was poor, but it had improved in 1.5 years to good in known context. Joey still has difficulty with clear production of phonemes in early literacy activities. So the goal selected for Joey out of Review360 for SLPs was by the end of 36 weeks, Joey will reduce use of word patterns with consonant cluster simplification and consonant cluster reduction in all word positions to 15% of occurrences or 85% correct production monitored over 4 consecutive sessions. His intervention plan was to continue the cycles approach for cycle 3 and possibly cycle 4 if needed, continue to work on cycle 2 objectives for liquid clusters, medial and final ST, and other consonant clusters, most specifically 3 consonant clusters. The intervention plan also called for one 45-minute session per week of pull-out services. When Joey was in preschool, his service delivery schedule of services was one 60-minute session per week of speech-language therapy services. In kindergarten, he's been cut back to one 45-minute session per week of pull-out services to fit in with the kindergarten schedule at that campus. And it was also discussed and felt that that 45-minute session would meet Joey's needs. So the planning process included starting with the student needs, reviewing the relevant standards in kindergarten, and they were located in the reading, probably reading for foundational skills, but the English language arts standards, completing a gap analysis between the student's present level and the grade expectations, developing a SMART goal, specific measurable goal, and using research-based or evidence-based practices for designing the intervention, working with the teachers to schedule the therapy and to use kindergarten level vocabulary for the target words that matched what Joey's speech targets were. And then finally, measuring progress in cycles 3 and possibly cycle 4 using Review360 to look at how Joey was doing in terms of meeting the objectives. Okay, let's move to a couple of language case studies. Case study number 2 is Antonio, who's 8 years old and a 3rd grader. He has a language disorder in the areas of syntax, morphology, and vocabulary. Antonio's history is that he had been receiving speech-language therapy services since he was in kindergarten. His IEP team shifted his goals over time to focus more attention on his language deficits, specifically his comprehension and use of syntax and morphology, now that he no longer has speech sound errors. So first, looking at the relevant standards from third grade English language arts in the area of literacy. These are actually mostly language standards. The relevant standards are that he needs to be able to explain the function of nouns, pronouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. Explain the function of these structures, grammar structures, is a very rigorous objective for third graders. So note that and weave that into your therapy with second and third graders, that they not only move through your activities, but pull back and do the metalinguistic approach to being able to explain why these parts of speech do what they do and why they're needed. Other relevant standards. Third graders need to form and use comparative and superlative adjectives and adverbs and choose between them depending on what is to be modified. Third graders use coordinating and subordinating conjunctions. They produce simple, compound, and complex sentences. You also look for language disorder students. You may also need to back up a couple of grade levels below current grade level to see if there are any language standards or speaking and listening standards that have not yet been mastered. And in Antonio's case, there's a second grade standard for using reflexive pronouns that he is not yet proficient with, and using frequently occurring conjunctions and using frequently occurring adjectives are first grade standards that Antonio needs to work on. So we know a little bit about Antonio, and we've looked at the relevant standards. Next, we need to look at where Antonio is relative to those standards. So looking at his present levels, we can see that he's been working on plural nouns, regular and irregular verbs, subject-verb agreement, and producing complete, simple, and compound sentences. He's mastered the use of personal pronouns, but still needs to work on reflexive pronouns, even though that may be at an earlier grade level. He struggles with comparative and superlative adjectives and adverbs, and struggles with the use of conjunctions. So notice that the present level statement talks a little bit about what Antonio can do and also what he struggles with. And it's the things that he struggles with at grade level or at lower grade levels that become the core for writing the SMART goals and objectives for the students. So the IEP team and the speech-language pathologist in particular chose 3 different areas to work on based on Antonio's history and his present levels and educational relevance, what seemed to be the most important for him to take on at grade level in order to do well and move through meeting standards at grade level. So by the end of 36 weeks, Antonio will demonstrate third grade level grammar by using comparatives and superlative adjectives and adverbs in conversation with 75% accuracy, by using reflexive pronouns with 75% accuracy, and in the area of written language, he'll demonstrate third grade level written language by writing compound sentences using a conjunction and 2 phrases with 70% accuracy. Moving on to intervention planning based on those goals, we are going to do some activities in therapy related to the goal for comparatives and superlatives, some activities that are evidence-based, working on reflexive pronouns, and some activities for writing compound sentences using coordinating conjunctions. When you go into the interventions available in Review360, you'll find an area listed for each one of the subunits of the different parts of language: semantics, syntax, morphology, pragmatics, metalinguistics. And you'll go to the areas of syntax and morphology, to comparatives and superlatives, and you'll find the target skill and then find some language strategies or activities that will get you started in terms of working in that area. So many of the language lessons start with a direct teach piece of 5 to 10 minutes called a mini lesson, followed by different engaging ways to practice the skill that was presented in the 5 to 10 minute mini lesson in the direct teach piece. So you'll see developed mini lessons across each of the areas in the interventions for Antonio. In the area of comparatives and superlatives, you can develop a series of 5 to 10 minute lessons on adjectives and adverbs with multiple examples of comparative and superlative adjectives. And then practice, the most common ones, even if they're below grade level. Practice them orally and in writing to the point of automaticity. Good, better, best is something you just have to memorize. And so the direct teach and then practice, the next therapy session, a reminder of the direct teach piece, practice, and really make it fun and engaging and quick pace so that you know that Antonio's getting it to the point of automaticity. And then work with the teacher to identify comparative and superlatives used in textbooks and in supplemental materials across the content areas to make sure that you are reviewing classroom materials and classroom instruction and providing grade level material as you work on comparatives and superlatives. So you may use the same content area, you may use a social studies lesson, you may use expository text or narrative, a story to work on comparatives and superlatives. Just make sure that what you're working on in terms of the extended practice is on grade level. In the area of reflexive pronouns, you're going to give a mini lesson, a direct teach piece about reflexive pronouns and teach reflexive pronouns, then repeated practice, and then Eisenberg had an activity called write or revise activity. Is that right? If it's not right, revise it in terms of reflexive pronouns, and you can look at the interventions to get a description of the intervention in Review360. And then finally, in the area of writing compound sentences, the direct teach piece through the mini lesson, Eisenberg had a which one fits activity in terms of which conjunction that would fit into a sentence. You can also, Benjamin and Hugelmeyer in 2013 gave some activities for understanding science using compound sentences that I thought was very powerful in terms of working in a content area on a specific target for speech-language pathology services. So think about how hard it would be to do science if you didn't have conjunctions in your repertoire. So I really liked that activity for encouraging a specific speech-language skill while using a content area. So in terms of our steps for analyzing and planning intervention, this is step 5, which would be coming up with designing the intervention. And then, of course, step 6 is implementing the intervention, implementing the activities, and then monitoring progress with Review360 for SLPs in order to get the data not only about progress, but about the present level statement in order to enter the next cycle of IEP development if needed. Okay, well, let's move on to the last case study, which is another language case. And Maria is 10 years old, and she's in 4th grade. She has a language disorder in the area of vocabulary. A little about her history. She has been receiving speech-language services since being enrolled in early intervention after being first fitted with hearing aids at 4 months of age. Although she has progressed well in the past 10 years, she continues to have a vocabulary deficit. So, looking first at the relevant standards in 4th grade, in the area of vocabulary or semantics, students need to be able to determine or clarify meaning of unknown and multiple meaning words, use common Greek and Latin affixes and roots as clues to meaning of a word, use context as a clue to meaning, explain simple similes and metaphors, and demonstrate understanding of words using antonyms and synonyms. The next step is to look at Maria's present levels and the necessary language skills that Maria will need in order to meet grade level objectives. So, in terms of her most recent language test data, language skills are scattered with age level performance in syntax, but significant weaknesses in understanding and using abstract vocabulary and figurative language. The teacher reports that Maria is attentive but seldom asks questions and needs extra time to complete reading and writing tasks. She usually masters new vocabulary if directly taught, but has difficulty with relatively common vocabulary understood by other students. Her writing is filled with simple, concrete vocabulary. So, what does that sound like to you? To me, that sounded like a lot of work at Tier 2 vocabulary, which crosses content areas and which students have not received direct instruction on because most children acquire that vocabulary developmentally as they move through the years and move through the grades in school. So there's 3 areas that goals and objectives were developed for. By the end of 36 weeks, Maria will demonstrate use of grade level vocabulary by using Tier 2 vocabulary words and sentences with 70% accuracy in 4 writing assignments. Using multiple meaning words and sentences with 70% accuracy in 4 writing assignments, and using figurative language in sentences, idioms, similes, and metaphors with 70% accuracy in 5 writing assignments. Note that in your data collection system for Maria, you will have to specify which Tier 2 vocabulary words you're working on, which multiple meaning words at grade level, 4th grade level, you're working on, and which figurative language you are targeting for Maria so that you can measure against the expectations to get to 70% accuracy. So any IEP goal or objective falls short without the specificity to back it up behind it that may not necessarily be written in the IEP objective, but is certainly written in the progress monitoring folder or the progress monitoring electronic binder that you may keep for students. So be sure and specify which Tier 2 words, which multiple meaning words, and aligned with grade level, and then which figurative language. So those are the goals for Maria. And then looking at steps 5 and 6, designing the intervention and monitoring progress, we can see that in the area of Tier 2 vocabulary strategies, as I've mentioned, that you want to specify the grade level Tier 2 vocabulary target words in order to monitor progress. Honig, Diamond, and Gutland have recommended word webs to work on vocabulary, read and respond, and which word belongs are 3 examples of strategies that are suggested in the language intervention section under Semantics in Review360. For multiple meaning words, there's an activity or strategy called multiple meaning match. And then in the area of figurative language, there are storybooks, and visualizing, verbalizing is a strategy that Linda Mood Bell has recommended that works well for students. And then, of course, after you've specified what you're working on, the actual vocabulary targets, and provided the intervention. You're going to monitor progress throughout and note progress relative to expectations for mastery of that goal or objective, and have the data available for the student, for the parents, for the teacher, and for planning for the present level statement for the next cycle of IEP development if appropriate. Okay, so let's review what we've talked about. Review360 for SLPs reviews, starts with student needs, and then looks at, in step 1, reviewing the relevant standards that apply to that student and what the student will need to be successful on. Determine the necessary language skills to meet the standards. What are the language underpinnings of those relevant standards that the student may struggle with because of the language or communication disorder. Then analyzing present level and current skills, and writing SMART goals and objectives available through Review360. You may need to add specificity, but you can make adaptations and adjustments and customization in Review360 for each student that you're working with. So the SMART goals and objectives available in Review360 for SLPs are tied to standards. And then further, evidence-based interventions are also suggested that allow you to provide educationally relevant services and help students become stronger learners in school. And then finally, the last step is to monitor progress with Review360 for SLPs so that you can celebrate mastery of IEP goals and objectives and move towards dismissal, or so that you have data available to deliver or determine the present levels for the next IEP cycle of planning that you'll be doing. So I want to say thank you very much for joining this broadcast and for participating in this session.
And Judy, we have a couple of questions that we have 1 minute left, if that's okay. Someone asked if we would be able to obtain the references that are listed or that are noted in the handout because we don't have a list. So if so, we could post that on our website.
Yes, the references are all available. I thought they were available in Review360, but if not, I'll get with the Pearson people and be sure to list those. But there is a document of references that may be a supplemental document that can be made available on the website. Absolutely.
Okay, great. And then we had another question. Where is the best place to find grade level vocabulary lists?
That is an ongoing struggle. I think that the best place is with the grade level teachers at your campus, or if the district has a scope and sequence document that lists, in the first 6 or 9 weeks we're working on this topic and this topic and this topic, there are likely to be the grade level vocabulary words tied to it. But I think it's going to be dependent on the scope and sequence in each district as they try to meet the state standards or the Common Core state standards.
And our last question, do we have pragmatic language goals and interventions available as well as those for secondary students?
The pragmatic goals that are available that you may be able to tweak to meet needs of secondary students are probably listed under speaking and listening goals. That seems to be, or under, I don't think there's any under writing goals. I'm assuming that the best place would be to look under the speaking and listening goals and then just customize or adapt wording to get to the pragmatic language goals. It's a great area for us to expand or increase the product if there's enough demand for it. And if anybody wants to help me with that, great, tell me.
Some people had questions about whether this would be available. This webinar will be posted on speechandlanguage.com, the recording, and so that will be posted probably by next week if you were unable to listen to the entire webinar. Thank you for joining us, Judy. That was excellent. I'm sure we got certainly a lot of interest. There's a lot of people online. And you can find more information about Review360 on pearsonclinical.com. If you look for Review360 for speech-language pathologists, there are a lot of resources on the Resources tab that you can take a look at. Thanks for joining us today.